Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Lynfa Davies. Lynfa has been keeping bees with her husband Rob for approximately 15 years. She keeps 20 colonies in and around her home near Aberystwyth in West Wales. She's a master beekeeper, and in 2019 she achieved the National Diploma in Beekeeping. She's since taken on the role as Secretary of the NDB Examinations Board. So without any further ado, Lynfa's presentation this afternoon is entitled Spring Cleaning the Honeybee Way.
Hello and welcome everyone to this workshop on comb management. So what are we going to look at today? Basically, I want to discuss with you today how we can manage our bees so that we can keep them on comb that is cleaner. And we'll have a bit of a think about what the bees need, and then I'm going to discuss a few options for how we can actually manipulate the bees and get them onto clean comb. So first of all, when we want our bees to build comb, we have to provide them with some resources if those resources aren't already available to them. So the first thing is space. Now, in order for bees to build comb, they obviously need somewhere to do it, and they're going to be much more inclined to do that if they have the space to do it. And also it's worth saying that it's really important that we work with our bees when we expect them to build new comb. And probably the simplest thing to do is to try and do your comb management, any manipulations to get them onto new comb early in the season, because when the bees are building up during the spring, they're much more inclined to build comb. And so by working with them, it's a much easier process. So for example, if you try to do this job much later in the season, the bees are less inclined to do it because they just naturally don't have that requirement for extra space then. The other time when it's quite useful to take advantage of the bees' natural instincts is when you collect swarms. Swarms are naturally pre-programmed to build combs, and you can actually take advantage of that. And when you hive a swarm, you can actually give them an extra box of foundation and they'll draw that for you as well. Now, building comb is a huge demand on the bees. It requires a lot of feed to provide the nutrients that they need. And that's feed both in terms of nectar and pollen. So if they're not available, particularly the nectar side of things, if you don't have a strong nectar flow, then we will need to feed. And actually, as a matter of course, when we're doing full comb changes, we provide feed for them in the form of sugar syrup. And then the final thing bees need when they're drawing comb is warmth. And they will actually hang in clusters. They'll hang together in dense clustered chains to raise the temperature slightly of the area where they're working. And that enables them then to secrete the wax secretions from their wax glands when they're building comb. And just a little bit then on why we should change comb. We're obviously kind of diving into this workshop knowing that I'm going to be talking about changing comb. So why should we do it? And the main reason here is disease build-up on the combs. So the obvious ones are the foul broods, American and European foul brood. Those spores will build up on the comb if they're present, of course. And so doing regular comb changes just naturally just clears out any sort of things that might be grumbling around. Obviously, if you suspect foul broods, the first thing to do is to call your bee inspectors and they will advise then on what you need to do. But other common diseases that perhaps we're more familiar with are things like nosema and chalk brood, which can be problematic in your hives. And doing comb changes will help to clear out these from your colonies. And so just by getting your bees onto fresh comb, any disease that's building up on the comb and perhaps transferring from generation to generation can then be reduced. And I've also mentioned Varroa here because actually one of the manipulations that I'm going to describe, the shook swarm, is an excellent way of actually controlling Varroa as well, because you remove the brood as well as the old comb. Any Varroa mites that are trapped within that brood get eliminated from the hive too. So it's actually an excellent way of just reducing varroa loads early in the season too. And the other great thing about doing comb changes is it actually makes your inspections far easier to do. The comb being much lighter in colour, I find that it makes seeing eggs and young larvae a lot easier. And so then it's much easier to see what stage of development they're at, so that you can understand, where they are in their life cycle. Also, if you've got any comb or frames within the colony that have perhaps become a bit warped or damaged and the bees have started building brace comb, it can become quite difficult to move these frames, and every time you go into them you're having to break away this brace comb. So just by having them onto fresh comb can just eliminate all of that and make your inspections much easier. So in the wild, wax moths actually do a great job of clearing away old comb. If you've got bees in a cavity in a tree, for example, the wax moths live alongside them, eating away at the old comb and then clearing it away so that the bees then have space to build back into that area. So we obviously don't want wax moths in our colonies, and so that's why we need to do some of these manipulations just to help them out. So how do you know when you need to replace your comb? And basically, if you work on approximately a 3-year cycle and try and aim to replace the combs, particularly your brood combs, you don't need to worry so much about your super combs, but particularly your brood combs replace on a 3-year cycle. And you'll actually find that your combs become very darkened over time. And this dark staining is due to generations of brood cycles and the cocoons that get left behind from the pupation process. And that makes the comb very dark, as well as the staining from the bees when they're walking over the comb. They carry pigments on them from the pollen and propolis that they collect, and this contributes then to the colouring of the wax. So over time, your wax becomes much darker and much harder to see what's happening. So if you work on a 3-year cycle, then you'll always have comb that's much easier to work with. Now, the simplest form of comb replacement is literally just to move any old comb or comb that isn't used out of the colony. So if they're not using the comb and it's dark and not wanted anymore, then you can just take it straight out and put foundation in its place. If you've got dark comb within the brood nest and they do have some brood in it, well, over time, as you do your inspections, just gradually move it to the outer edge of the frames, as you can see here with the black coloured frames in this diagram. With each inspection, just move it one stage to the edge. And then when all the brood has emerged, on the next inspection, then you can remove it and then replace it with foundation. Now, this isn't quite as easy as it sounds, because if you suddenly get a nectar flow, you can then come back to do your inspection again next week and find that a frame that you thought would be ready to remove, they've actually filled it with nectar. And so, you're then kind of in a quandary about what you do. So if you've got combs that can immediately be taken out, this method works quite well. But if you've got combs that are all full of brood, then actually there's a couple of methods, namely the Bailey comb change or the shook swarm, that are much more effective methods of comb replacement. So the first thing I'm going to talk to you about then, the first sort of main manipulation, is the Bailey comb change. And the principle behind this is that you're providing them with a new box of frames, and those frames can either be made up of foundation, or if you have it, some drawn sterilised comb is useful. But don't worry if you don't have any. And what you do is you allow them to move on to those new frames. And then once they've drawn out the new foundation and they've moved up and your queen is laying and you've got brood in that box, and eventually then you can remove all the old comb. It does require feed because you're asking them to build a lot of comb in one go. And unless you've got a very strong nectar flow, you will need to feed them for this manipulation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a video demonstrating a Bailey comb change and how to do it. I do need you to use a little bit of imagination, because this video was filmed at the end of February on quite a sunny day, so I did have a few bees trying to help me, but there is no colonies in the hives that I'm using. So it's a demonstration of the technique, but with no bees. But hopefully you'll get the idea of how to do it. Okay, so today we're going to do a manipulation called the Bailey comb change to get this nice strong colony here that's on about 8 frames of brood onto fresh comb. So the equipment I'll be using is a clean brood box, and inside the brood box I've got frames of foundation, and I've also got in here a couple of frames of partially drawn comb that I've cleaned and sterilised. Now if you don't have this, don't worry, you can just use all foundation. The other bits of equipment I've got are some dummy boards, just in case I need to make the brood box smaller. And then here I've got an eek with a small entrance notch made in it, and that's what we'll use as the entrance for them while they're changing onto the new brood box. And then finally I've got a bucket to give them some feed. So that's all of the equipment ready, and now we're ready to start the manipulation. So the first thing to do is to take the centre frame out of this box, and we're going to now go through this colony and find the queen and put her in this space. So the first thing to do is to open up your colony. Take off the crown board and the queen excluder. Now you would go through this colony normally and you would look for the queen, and you don't need to take her off the frame, you just need to find the frame that she's on. So, having gone through the colony, we found our queen, and we're just going to put this frame into this space in amongst all foundation. Now the next thing to do is, if the bees just aren't using some of the frames, they're not working on those at all, you can remove them and make the space smaller. So those are usually the outer edge frames, so I'm just going to remove those from the box. And then push all these frames up together. And then I can use a dummy board now to make this box smaller. Now I need to mirror that in this box. So I've got 8 frames of brood in here, so I'm just going to remove a couple of these frames to have the same effect in the bottom box. Push those frames up, and again use a dummy board to make the space the same. So now we have our queen and all the foundation in here, and then we have all the brood and all the bees in this box. Okay, so the next stage is to put this box on top of this box. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to close off this entrance. Now that I've closed off that entrance, I need to give them a new entrance, and that's what this is for. So this entrance goes directly above the old entrance, and they'll find that really quickly, and then it means that when the bees are coming and going, they don't have to travel across the old comb to get to the new box. They come directly in and straight into the new fresh box. The next thing is the queen excluder. and this goes on top of the entrance, and that means that any drones that emerge in the bottom box can still get out. And then on top of this we put the fresh box. And I've got it arranged such that the new combs are directly over the old combs, and that enables the bees then to just work with, you know, a similar kind of amount of space in both boxes. Next goes the crown board, and then on top of this I put my feeder. I'm just using a bucket feeder, and obviously you would fill this with feed. I don't have feed in it for this demonstration, and that goes on top of the crown board. And then I have a super here to protect that, and then the roof goes on top. So that's the end of the main manipulation. Okay, now it's 1 week later, and what we're going to check for today is whether they need more food. Remember, we put an old frame of comb in this box, so we're going to remove that, and we're going to check for queen cells in the bottom box. So first thing, we open the hive. Take off the feeder. And the crown board. And I'm just going to lift this box and put it down here. Then I can take away the queen excluder and the temporary floor. Now the first thing to look for are queen cells. Now sometimes when you do a manipulation like this and you separate the brood from the queen, even though, you know, it's only by a small amount of space, they will sometimes build queen cells. So you need to go through every frame of brood really carefully and remove any queen cells that they've made. And then I'm just going to make a space here, and I'm going to have a look in this box, and the old frame that we put up here last week with the queen on, I'm going to put back down in here. So I find that frame, and if the queen still happens to be on this frame, you need to lift her off, pop this frame in here, and then just put the queen on a frame in this box and put her back in. Now by now they should have made a really good start of drawing out this foundation, and so I can add in some more foundation now. So I'm going to place these frames in here. And now I can put it back together again. So first of all, the temporary entrance. Then the queen excluder. Then the brood box. And the crown board. And I'm going to give them a bit more feed because I've given them some more foundation, and if you feel that there's not a particularly strong nectar flow on, just give them a little bit more feed. And then close them back up. Okay, now it's 2 weeks later again, but at least 3 weeks since the original manipulation. And what we can do now is we can remove this bottom box because all the brood will have emerged. So I need 2 pieces of equipment today. So I've brought along a clearer board. Now if we find that there's still a lot of bees in this box, sometimes it's easier to use a clearer board to remove them. If there's just a few, you can shake them out and take the box away. And I've also got a fresh clean floor, and I'm going to change the floor as well. So let's open up the hive. Now by now they should have drawn all the foundation quite well, so they shouldn't need any more food. So first of all, I'm going to lift the box where the queen is and all the fresh comb onto the roof. I'm going to remove the queen excluder and the temporary entrance. Now, if I've still got lots and lots of bees in here, I'm going to swap the boxes around, so put this one on the top with a clearer board to get the bees out. But like I say, if there aren't many bees in here, you can just take it straight away. And I'm also going to take away this floor and clean it up, and I'll just use a blowtorch just to flame it. So the first thing I need is my clean floor. And now I've got the entrance open, so the bees can reorientate back to their original entrance, and they'll do that very quickly. I can place this box of fresh, lovely drawn comb with the queen now laying in her new comb, and while you've got the colony open, you may want to take the opportunity to have a look through and do an inspection. So the next thing is how many bees are left in the old box of comb. And like I say, if there are still a lot, then the simplest thing to do is just place a crown board. I use this rhombus type crown board quite often. Place the clearer board over the crown board, and then I can just put the old box with all the bees still in it on top, and within 24 hours all the bees will have gone and they'll be back down with their queen, and then you can remove it then. And then you can take away the clearer board. And there you have it. Your colony now is on lovely fresh comb. It's taken us a few weeks to do this manipulation, but it's quite a gentle process. The colony should now respond really well to being on fresh comb and should build up nicely, particularly as nectar flows come online. So quite soon you'll need to put a queen excluder and a super on top as well, and hopefully we'll get a honey crop from this colony. Okay, so hopefully that video demonstrated what you need to do. And just in summary, what's good about the Bailey comb change is it doesn't shock the colony. You're not removing and wasting that brood that they've already created. So you're not removing something that they've put a huge amount of resource into. It's good for small colonies or smaller colonies. And it is the best method for treating nosema in small colonies. But do be careful with this, and you definitely want to pick a time when there's a good weather window. Don't expect them to be able to draw comb if the weather suddenly turns very cold and wet. So you do need to keep an eye on the long range forecast when you're doing these manipulations. And that's particularly in the case when you're using slightly smaller colonies or colonies that you're treating for nosema. Now, the downside of the Bailey comb change is it takes 3 to 4 weeks to complete the entire manipulation. And of course, during that time, there is a possibility that disease could be transferred from the old comb to the new comb. So it's all about risk management, really. You know, what diseases do you think you might have? If it's things like chalk brood that aren't really going to pose a huge risk to the colony, then, you know, that's fine. If you suspect things like foul broods, well, you need to have called your bee inspector in anyway to have helped them to deal with that, and they'll be able to advise you on the next course of action. But the Bailey comb change is a good method for treating colonies that are slightly smaller and potentially have nosema, because it's a no-shock method that enables them to get onto new comb and away from any buildup of nosema spores that is on the comb, without sort of creating too much of an imposition on the colony. So the next method I'm going to talk about is the shook swarm. Now, this method you may be more familiar with. It's certainly used by the bee inspectors when they're treating some cases of European foul brood. But in this context now, we're talking about it as a method of comb management. And it's a much more abrupt approach to removing all the old comb within the colony that you can do just in one manipulation. And you quite literally shake the bees onto new comb, so from the old frames, and then you remove all those old frames, which includes the brood. So it is a bit of a shock to the system, but it is a very effective method. So I'm now going to show you a video where we demonstrate the shook swarm, again on a hive that has no bees in it, but hopefully you'll get the gist of what you need to do. So this is the colony that I'm simulating. It's a nice strong colony. It wants to really be at the point where you would be thinking of giving it a super. So, you know, 7 to 8 frames of brood and a nice brood box full of bees. The other equipment that I need is a nice clean brood box full of foundation, or if you have it, you can also use some drawn sterilised comb as well. But if you don't have that, don't worry, you can just use all foundation. Then the other things that we need are a clean queen excluder, clean crown board, and then also a clean floor. So everything there is ready to go. Now, as part of this manipulation as well, we will be feeding the bees, so you'll need a feeder as well, and I have a simple contact feeder here, and then I've got an empty super to protect it. Okay, so now we're ready to do the manipulation. So the first thing we're going to do is move the colony and all of its equipment over to one side so that we can put the new equipment into its place. So on the site, the original site, we can now place the clean floor. And then the next thing is the queen excluder. Now we're placing the queen excluder underneath the brood box for now, because when we shake the bees into this box, they'll basically have nothing. They won't have any brood to hold them there. So by placing the queen excluder underneath, it just prevents the queen from absconding. So the next thing is the fresh, clean brood box. And then the next thing to prepare is some space. So I'm going to remove the centre frames from this box. So I've taken out 6 frames, which gives me a nice big space here. Okay, so that's ready now. Now the next thing we need to do is have a look in this colony. So I'm going to remove the crown board and the queen excluder. And I'm going to go through the colony now as quickly as I can. And what I want to do is I want to find the queen. Now it's not essential to find the queen in this process, but it actually does kind of give you peace of mind. So if you're able to find the queen, just pop her in a little queen cage and you can just sit her there until you've finished, and then at least you know where she is, because we're going to be shaking the bees into here, so you don't want to risk shaking her onto the floor. So if you're able to find her and you can just pop her in a queen cage, then you can be assured where she is then. So then what we do is we go through the colony and we lift out each frame, and then we move across to the new site and we just shake all the bees into this gap. Now you need to be quite forceful, a nice sharp tap. Some people prefer to hold their hands like this on the frame and do it like this. You want to try if you can and avoid banging on the edge of the box, but you know, it is quite difficult, but that's why we make ourselves a space here, so that you can do it on the angle. And then you just put the frame back in and move to the next one, and then shake all the bees off of that frame. Now you need to work quite quickly. Don't rush, don't panic, but you are going to end up with quite a few bees in the air who will want to return to the combs that they've just come off, because that's where they recognise the smell. So you need to try and work through this as methodically but as quickly as you can. Shake all the bees in. If you do have space and equipment to have a third brood box, maybe behind you, you can put the empty combs that you've shaken away from here then into that box while you work. But if not, just do it like this. You shake all the bees from all the frames into here. And then in here, you end up with a pile of bees in this gap here. And you take the frames that you place to one side and you just gently place them in. Don't ram them in, because there's a pile of bees in the way. You just gently sit them on top and maybe just jostle it down a little bit, and the bees will then work up onto that comb. So you place all your combs into the space now. And close up the gap. Remember to release your queen, so put your queen back into this colony now. And then your clean crown board can go on top. And I'm also going to give them a feed. And then I have an empty super to protect the feeder, and then the roof can go back on. Now this old equipment then can be taken away from the apiary. You can render down the comb and clean up the frames and the brood box and the floor and all the other parts, ready for reuse. Now here we are 5 to 7 days later after doing the original manipulation, And what we can do now is we can check and see how well they're drawing out these frames, and has the queen started laying. If she has, and if there's brood there, you can remove this queen excluder now from underneath the brood box. Also check if they need more feed. If they haven't finished drawing the comb and there's still no nectar flow on, then maybe give them a little bit more feed. And that's it, job done. And they should build up and be a nice, strong, healthy colony for you very quickly. So in summary then, I think you'll agree that the shook swarm is a much quicker procedure. You do the whole job in one go. It's really good for disease control because you are removing those combs straight away. And it's excellent for varroa control as well, because any varroa mites that are trapped within that brood that you're removing are now going to be destroyed with that brood. And it really does clear out a huge proportion of the varroa. And then, of course, before that colony has also got any new brood sealed on the new combs, you can go in either with an oxalic acid treatment to remove the phoretic mites, or you can put a frame into the colony with unsealed brood and allow the mites to jump into that frame, and then you can remove that frame. So that's, another method of doing it without chemicals. If you're interested in these techniques of varroa control without using chemicals, the BBKA has a special issue on them that you can have a look at. And if you do the shook swarm in the right conditions, so again, choose a good weather window, provide them with feed, the bees will respond incredibly well to this, and very quickly they'll be back up to full strength with a full complement of brood and really building up as you want. So I really rate the shook swarm. Bees really do respond well to it. It might feel like it's a bit traumatic because you are just shaking all the bees into an empty box. And there is a risk of absconding. And of course, that's why we use the queen excluder underneath the brood box. You do get a slight break in brood production, but they bounce back from this, and very quickly you won't realise that that even happened. But it's definitely not suitable for small sickly colonies, so avoid doing it unless it's a nice strong colony that will be able to build comb very quickly. Now, I have referred a couple of times throughout my talks about using sterilised good comb. I don't have time to go into the method of how you do this, but I would like to just refer you to an excellent leaflet on the National Bee Unit's website called Fumigating Comb. So have a look at that, and that explains the process for using 80% acetic acid to fumigate any good comb that you want to reuse. So there we have it. Those are the methods that you can use to get your bees onto clean comb, and they really will benefit from you doing this. So do give it a go. And I'll be happy now to take any questions that you might have on some of the things that we've discussed here.
Okay, thank you very much, Lynfa. So the first question, which I think was asked during your section on the Bailey comb change, and the question is, or a statement, it begins, I tried to get my bees to do this during the end of March/April, over 4 weeks, and nothing was drawn at all, and the bees just decided to drown in sugar syrup feed. Any advice on how to get them to draw? I'm on 14/12 nationals and in Hampshire.
Okay, so I would suggest maybe you just tried it a little bit too early. So certainly if you tried it this year in March and early April, it would have been way too cold. And what we need to really focus on when we're doing comb changes like this, complete comb changes, when we're asking them to draw a full box of foundation, is we need to work with the bees and choose a time when the bees are actively building comb or actively wanting to build comb. So work with when the bees would naturally be building and enlarging their brood nest, because they're much more inclined to draw comb then, because it's much more kind of intuitive with what they would be doing at that time of year. So in March and early April this year, it was just way too cold. And the bees need to actually raise the temperature slightly when they're comb building. And they need to form these dense clusters to actually be able to secrete the wax properly. So if the weather is against them, it just makes the job much harder. So I would suggest this year, in Hampshire, you're probably, it's probably almost tropical compared to what it is up here with me in mid Wales. But for me up here, it's still too early for me to do comb changes based on the weather conditions we're having at the moment. And it looks like it is set to improve slightly. Temperatures are increasing. So if your ambient daytime temperatures are, up around 15 degrees, then, you might be able to start thinking about it. If you're still having hard frosts at night, then obviously that range in temperatures doesn't really work in the bees' favour. So just wait for it to get a little bit milder and then give it another go.
So any comments about the 14 by 12 frames that he or she is using?
Well, obviously they're bigger frames, so you've got a bigger surface area for them to draw. So, it's a bigger job. So, that's why you definitely need to be the weather conditions to be on your side. And yeah, you will need to feed them to be able to draw that much foundation.
So next question, what do you use to sterilise the drawn combs, either the ones that you're using to put in your new box or afterwards when you've finished your manipulations?
Yeah, so the recommendation is to use 80% acetic acid. And this you can buy from the beekeeping suppliers. So, make sure you're using the correct strength. And there is a really good fact sheet available on the MBU's website, because I haven't been able to spend enough time describing how to do this. But the important thing is to be really careful about your own protection. It's a strong acid, so you need the correct protective equipment when you're doing it. And, but apart from that, it's quite a simple procedure to do and very effective against things like nosema and chalk brood, wax moth. So it is well worth doing. Some of the beekeeping suppliers won't post out the acid. Some do. So I think it depends on which couriers they use. So you might just need to shop around to find one that does post it if you don't live within reach of the supply shops.
Yeah, and I should add, it will rot concrete as well. We said we had a shed for sterilising combs, and the concrete base was just breaking up because of the acid.
Yeah,
okay.
I do it outside. Yeah, I do it outside and just make sure that the stack of boxes is bee-proof and sealed when I do it.
Yep. So the syrup you were using, is that thin or thick syrup?
Yeah, that's a good question. And quite simply, it doesn't matter. So if you're using the proprietary syrups that you buy, then it comes in a fixed format. So you will just use that. So that's fine. Some people suggest that you should use thin syrup because it mimics the nectar flow. And obviously a nectar flow is thin syrup. If you use a thin syrup, you may have to give them more of it to provide them with relative amounts of nutrient that they need to draw that comb. So I've used either, and it both works. So don't get hung up on syrup density.
Okay. So how do you dispose of the frames with brood on them? Do you recycle frames or replace with the comb?
Yeah, so the frames with the brood, well, basically all the frames that I take out of the colony after having done the manipulation, all those frames then, I will render it down. So I use a box that's that I can then introduce steam into using like a wallpaper stripper type scenario and just steam clean them. And that melts all the wax, that runs out the bottom. You can then exchange the wax for foundation. and inside the steam box you're left with a pile of dross, which is all the old cocoons, all the dead brood, and any other debris that's left. And that then, because it's effectively been steamed and sterilised, that can go on the compost heap. And then the frames, if they haven't quite cleaned up properly, if they've still got a bit of propolis or comb, just a bit of wax attached to them, you can boil them in bicarbonate of soda. And that's really effective then at cleaning them up. And then you can use them again, refit them with foundation and use them. So, it's a bit of a messy job, takes a bit of effort, but it's well worth it.
Good. So still on the same topic, do you sterilise comb with sealed stores in it?
Yeah, you can do actually, as long as those stores are sealed. Don't do it if it's open stores. But yeah, if they're sealed, you can do it.
Okay. So is it advisable to delay feeding when carrying out shook swarm so that the bees bury disease in drawing out new comb? How long do you advise to delay?
That's an interesting question. So I think it all comes down to what you know about your colonies and what risks you're trying to mitigate against. So what diseases are you concerned about? And the ones that perhaps, get talked about the most in relation to sort of burying the disease in the comb are actually the foul broods. And if you're suspecting foul brood in your colony, well, that's a job for the bee inspectors and you need to get that dealt with correctly. So in this scenario, when you're doing a comb change on a healthy colony, because you just want to get them onto clean comb, then I would recommend that you feed from the outset.
Okay, so still on the topic of sterilising combs, does freezing the frames sterilise frames? So it depends what you're trying to sterilise them against again. If it's wax moth that you're concerned about, then yeah, 48 hours in a freezer will get rid of that. Some of the other diseases, the spores are much more resistant to freezing, and so they may not benefit from freezing. So again, it depends what you're concerned about and what you're trying to deal with. So I'm not quite sure which manipulation this one related to, but it says, how long do you leave the frame of eggs to catch the varroa? Sorry, I missed that.
Oh, so I assume this is with the shook swarm, when I mentioned that you can use it actually as a very useful form of varroa control. So if you want to put a bait frame essentially into that colony to mop up any phoretic mites, you need to do that before the queen starts laying herself, because obviously the mites will then just jump into her frames, and just leave it for a few days and you'll pick up most of the mites then. You could leave it until it's sealed, and then you've definitely got those mites in there. So you won't get 100% of them, because once the queen starts laying on other frames, the mites can also, transfer to them as well. But you will get a significant proportion of them.
Thank you. So a fairly long question here. So we're taught about assessing honey stores and what colony requirements are, but how much pollen stores does an average colony need, and when should this best be assessed?
Oh, that is a really interesting question, actually. So over the course of a year, a colony could use 20 to 25 kilos of pollen. So, those big sacks of potatoes that you can buy, they're 25 kilos. And that's a phenomenal amount of pollen. But it's actually quite difficult to say, I'm going to assess pollen on any one day, because pollen usage is very fluid within the hive. And while they do store it, they don't store it for long periods of time. They literally just put it around the edge of the brood nest, and it's for immediate use. So you may go in 1 week and see lots of lovely pollen around the edge of your brood nest. And then if there is a bit of a dearth in forage, you may go in the following week and there's absolutely no pollen in your hives because they've used it all, and any pollen that's coming in is being used immediately. It's also very difficult to assess pollen stores when the brood rearing rate is very high because they're using it so quickly that you may not actually see much around the edge of the brood nest. So it is quite a difficult thing to assess, and it's very difficult to actually physically, kind of put a level, a quantity on what you've got in the colony. So the important thing really is that you see some pollen in your colonies, and if you see big slabs of it, that's lovely. And to see pollen actively being brought in on a regular basis. And then you can also use the level of brood rearing as a bit of a monitor. So if brood rearing seems to slow down a bit, well, that might be in reaction to a bit of a dearth in forage, and so they're not getting the necessary nutrients that they need. So pollen is not an easy thing to monitor. While it appears to be very visual, it tends to disappear from the colonies very quickly as well.
Great. So I think we're coming towards the end of our question time, but maybe time for just one quick one. How much feed does it take to draw a full brood box of foundation?
So again, quite a difficult one. It depends if there's also a nectar flow on at the same time, but I would suggest you need to be prepared to probably give them 2 feeds of 5 litres. Do it 5 litres at a time, and then if they don't need so much, you don't need to give them the second feed.
Okay, well, we've run out of time for the questions, so thank you very much, Lynfa, for taking part, and thank you for your all the effort that was involved in making those videos. I think very well done. So thanks very much.